We begin in Ottawa. A fight that has dominated the House of Commons for weeks has finally ended with the Liberal government backing down. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, has agreed to testify before a committee on alleged Beijing-backed interference in federal elections. It follows weeks of Liberal filibustering at committee and a Conservative motion Tuesday that threatened to pit the NDP against the Liberal government.
We force this government to end the obstruction in committee and to allow the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister to testify.
It took weeks of pressure for the Prime Minister to back down and flip-flop. Will he allow Canadians to get to the truth and prevent this from happening again before the next election with a full public inquiry now?
That's why we named David Johnston as the independent expert to identify any gaps in our system. He will make public recommendations, which could include a formal inquiry.
Okay, on that question of a public inquiry, Special Rapporteur David Johnston received his mandate today, and it outlines two key dates. Johnston must decide by May 23rd whether he recommends a public inquiry into this matter. And he has until the end of October to finish all of his work. Dominic LeBlanc is Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Minister, thanks for joining us.
Hi, David.
So tell me why your government backed down and decided to let Katie Telford appear at committee.
We've been sending a number of officials to committee, senior public servants. I went myself with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. We think that committees can do a useful job in helping Canadians understand the measures in place to counter foreign interference in elections. We think, however, that it's necessarily a dysfunctional partisan context. The Conservatives, literally, David wrote a book on how to vandalize committees. J.L. authored a book on how to make sure they run into the ground. They're not interested in a serious exercise of understanding the right series of measures. We think David Johnston offers that opportunity in a transparent and independent way. But Ms. Telford, if it helps Parliament function better, has agreed to go for a couple of hours to a committee and answer questions.
But Liberals filibuster that for, I think, 23 hours of committee time, and the line from the government was that staff shouldn't testify, ministerial accountability is what matters, and then suddenly when Jagmeet Singh threatens to vote with the opposition to force her, you change your mind. So did Jagmeet Singh force the government's hand here?
The Conservatives actually sent ministers to committees when they refused to send Mr. Harper's staff. When I was an opposition MP, they argued that sacred principle of ministerial accountability. We think that ministers are the proper authorities to go to parliamentary committees, and we think the best way to get answers for Canadians and reassure Canadians that all of the appropriate measures have been in place and will continue to strengthen them is to allow the Right Honourable David Johnston to do his work. But if it allows the parliamentary, the Procedures and House Affairs Committee that has important work, for example, to do on electoral redistribution, if it allows that committee to return to a normal functioning context, Ms. Telford will go and answer questions. The Conservatives know, David, that many of the questions that they pretend they want to ask Ms. Telford are protected by national security confidences. They want a partisan show. If it allows Parliament to function better, Ms. Telford has accepted to do that. At the end of the day, David Johnston is the best way to get the answers.
And I'm going to answer with David Johnston in a second, but I just want to understand the thought process here, because you were facing the uncertainty of a vote after question period today, in which the New Democrats were threatening to side with the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois to order her to testify under oath at the Ethics Committee if you didn't relent on the filibuster at Proc. So regardless of what the Conservatives were doing, was it the NDP's move that forced the Liberals to make this shift to agree that Katie Telford would testify at the Procedures Committee?
No, it wasn't. It was our desire to have the Procedures Committee be able to return to a normal functioning process. The Conservatives,
after 23 hours of filibuster on the eve of this vote?
But David, the Conservatives have wanted to vandalize committees. This motion that they tried to pass today would have sent a whole series of officials to a Privacy and Ethics Committee, nothing to do with the Elections Act or foreign interference in democratic institutions. Why did they want to do that? Oh, because there's a Conservative chair and they'll be able to make more partisan theater out of this. When Pierre Poilievre was minister responsible for democratic institutions, CSIS identified foreign interference in elections as a serious concern in 2013. The Conservatives did absolutely nothing about that, and Mr. Poilievre astoundingly admitted to me in question period that, of course, they didn't do anything about it because it wasn't harming the Conservative Party. Well, if you're Minister of Democratic Institutions, your job is not actually to only advance the partisan interest of the Conservative Party.
Right. But, you know, your partner in the confidence and supply agreement threatened to vote against you to order the chief of staff to the prime minister to testify under oath unless you relented on the filibuster. The New Democrats are taking credit for what's happening today, saying this is happening because of them. You're saying, despite the timeline and the way these facts line up, it had nothing to do with this decision?
David, you've been around here a long time. I've been in opposition too. It's not the first time that an opposition party takes credit for something. You have to take all of that with a grain of salt. I sit on the Supply and Confidence Oversight Committee with 2 other Liberal MPs and 3 NDP MPs. We have regular meetings to look at the Supply and Confidence Agreement. The good news is that process is working very well. And I think in terms of the commitments that Mr. Singh and the Prime Minister made in their agreement, we're working diligently on all sides to implement those agreements. So the Supply and Confidence Agreement, as between the Liberals and the NDP, is working very well. It's very solid, and Canadians are going to see the results of that effort from Mr. Singh and the Prime Minister to make Parliament work.
Okay, so on David Johnston and on the mandate, the terms of reference that has been released today, the guidelines that he will conduct his work. The first point says his mandate will be to assess the extent and impact of foreign interference in Canada's electoral processes. It doesn't limit it just to the 2019 and 2021 federal elections. Does this mean he can look at nominations, municipal, provincial, whatever he chooses to look into? This gives him that freedom to do that?
It does. It does. We deliberately designed, obviously with Mr. Johnston's input, terms of reference that he was comfortable with. And they were designed, if you look at the 5th term of reference at the end, it's basically sort of a catch-all thing that, and any other issue in his judgment that he thinks is relevant to this exercise. So it wasn't designed to circumscribe his mandate. It wasn't designed to limit what he can review. It was designed to have an eminent Canadian appointed by Mr. Harper as Governor General of Canada, somebody whose integrity we think is unimpeachable, look in an independent and secure way at all of these different elements and provide public and transparent advice to the government and to Canadians on what's working well and what can be done to strengthen it.
So this report we've had in the Globe and Mail about CSIS having concerns about what's happening in the Vancouver municipal election, for example, the most recent one. Kennedy Stewart was on this show and said he'd been briefed by 2 CSIS agents who were talking to him because they were frustrated of people up the chain. I don't know if that meant CSIS or politically, not listening and not responding. He can look into that. There's nothing to stop him from looking into that particular election.
Well, I don't know what Mr. Kennedy was told by CSIS agents that met with him. Obviously, I don't have any information on those conversations. What we've said is that Mr. Johnston's mandate is to look at foreign interference in Canadian elections. And by the way, it's not only from one country. It's not only China that has in the past attempted to interfere in democratic processes. So we think Mr. Johnston should deliberately have an independent and broad mandate, and we trust that he will go where the evidence takes him.
So he's going to have full access to classified and unclassified material because he has security clearance as a former Governor General. I suppose you could swear him in even if he didn't. How much freedom will he have in reporting on that, though? I'll give you an example. The stories about Han Dong, who's in your caucus. You know, there have been reports by Global News saying that the Prime Minister and his staff were briefed by CSIS about concerns about him as a particular candidate, something they've never addressed directly because of national security concerns. If David Johnston finds something there, can he report on this? How much can he say about the classified information that he will have access to? Will he have the same restrictions as you had and others had when you testified at committee?
Well, again, I'm not an expert in how the secrecy legislation applies to national security. I think Canadians should trust Mr. Johnston, who will have, as you said, complete access to all of the information, to all of the officials that in his judgment, his independent judgment, he thinks can be helpful. And he will then report publicly to Canadians and to opposition party leaders, it's clearly in his terms of reference, on what he finds and what recommendations he can make about further measures that the government could take to strengthen the already robust measures. So he's starting his job today.
Sure.
Let's not prejudge what an interim report before the end of May might say, or a final report on Halloween night, but no later than October 31st. So we have full confidence that Mr. Johnston will do this work in a serious way. And we look forward, frankly, in a transparent and open way to sharing his findings with Canadians.
But point 2, section B of his terms of reference says he will be asked to determine what was communicated to the Prime Minister and his office, other ministers and their offices and cabinet in general. So he will determine what the Prime Minister knew, what his office knew, and when. But how much of that will he be allowed to disclose to Canadians? I guess that's the central question, because the allegation has been you were told this, you were told that, and you didn't act on it. Will he be able to be the arbiter to say to the public the Prime Minister knew or didn't know, was advised to act or not advised to act? Will we get that level of clarity when this process is over?
Well, first of all, in part of your comment, you said that the allegation or the assertion is that we didn't act, and that we think is not borne out by the facts at all. As a government, we've acted like no other previous government in putting together the robust mechanisms to ensure that our elections are free and fair and have not been influenced in terms of the outcome in any riding by an attempt of foreign interference. Mr. Johnston has, and you read it very precisely, David, the mandate to look at that issue amongst others that he in his judgment determines are relevant, and then to report in a public way to Canadians. So we should frankly have confidence in the Right Honourable David Johnston to do this work, and we've deliberately designed, with his input of course, the terms of reference that allow him the freedom to independently do this work.
So when this is done, because it's a question of disclosure and transparency that I'm concerned about here, David Johnston will be able to say the Prime Minister or his ministers were told this on this particular date, this was the recommended course of action, and here's what they did or didn't do based on that. We'll be able to get that level of clarity? Am I right in that assumption?
But you're prejudging where the evidence and the information will take him.
I'm trying to understand what latitude he has in disclosure.
I think we should have full confidence in his judgment, in his integrity, in his desire to do this work for Canadians in a thorough and independent way. And I know Mr. Johnston a little bit. I've had the pleasure to work with him on a couple of issues after he retired as Governor General. I have absolutely every confidence that he recognizes that the transparency, as you noted, is important in reassuring Canadians. And when they hear from him after he's begun his work in his interim report by the end of May and in his final report by the end of October, I think all of those very important questions that you're asking will be answered by Mr. Johnston.
Yeah, I'm certainly not trying to cast aspersions on his reputation or his judgment. I'm just trying to understand, you know, the latitude that he has here.
It's very broad.
And just as a final question, you mentioned May 23rd. That's when he has to make a decision or a recommendation. Well, it'll be a decision because the Prime Minister says you'll do what he says on the inquiry. Do you think with where things are right now, there's any doubt in your mind that we'll end up having a public inquiry on this whole thing?
Again, David, you're asking me to prejudge what Mr.
What do you think, though?
I think we should let Mr. Johnston do this important work. We should let him have access to all of the confidential information, and we should rely on his judgment to tell the government and transparently Canadians what he thinks is the best next steps to follow in ensuring that Canadians are reassured that our institutions are protected and safe and functioning freely and democratically. So I think we should leave that to Mr. Johnston. The good news is, you said it, it's sort of by the long weekend in May, we'll have the benefit of his judgment. The Prime Minister, of course, has committed to following his advice.
Okay, Minister, thanks for your time.
Thank you, David.
Okay, now we're going to get some opposition reaction. Peter Julian is the House Leader for the New Democratic Party. Mr. Julian, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start just where I left off with Minister LeBlanc. Are you satisfied with the mandate that David Johnston has been given, in particular the deadline of May 23rd to decide on a public inquiry or not?
We think Mr. Johnston has credibility. We believe, as well, as we've said all along, and Jagmeet Singh's been very clear about this, we need a public inquiry. When we look at the people who are most experienced in the field, Jean-Pierre Kingsley from Elections Canada, a number of former security heads have all said that a public inquiry is needed and warranted. And we believe ultimately that's where Mr. Johnston will go. And so the time frame, I think, allows for him to reflect upon what is a clear interest and need for a public inquiry, and we expect that that's the direction it'll go in.
If it doesn't go as you expect, are you prepared to live with the decision if former Governor General Johnston says, no, a public inquiry is not the answer here?
We believe a public inquiry is necessary, and we're going to continue to push that. We also feel, though, that the rapporteur ultimately will come to that conclusion.
Right, but if he doesn't, I mean...
Well, that's hypothetical. That's hypothetical.
Sure, but
right?
you'll continue the push. If he does, that's great. If he doesn't, you're going to keep pushing for it?
We believe, and it's absolutely necessary when we hear about the allegations that have come forward from a wide variety of foreign actors, not just China, Russia, of course, Iran, India. There have been concerns expressed. It's very important that we get to the bottom of this. That's why Jagmeet Singh gave effectively an ultimatum today, saying that we needed to have Katie Telford come to committee, and the government backed down on that. And as a result of that, I think Canadians will get answers that are important.
So tell me about how you came to that decision on the ultimatum that your leader issued today, that either Katie Telford comes to the Procedures Committee and testifies there, or we're going to vote with the Conservatives. You had a lengthy caucus meeting last night. I'm told it was about 3 hours long.
The Democrats love to talk.
Was everyone on board with this? Was the caucus totally united on this, or did some of you want to vote against the Conservatives?
Well, you saw the vote in the House today, of course, and we all voted no. This is after first the ultimatum, the government saying, okay, we will stop blocking Katie Telford from coming forward. And then the NDP, largely NDP-influenced motion passed through Procedure and House Affairs, which allows for a number of witnesses, not just Katie Telford and Jenny Burns, former campaign manager for Pierre Poilievre, but a number of other important people that have, I think, answers will help to clear the allegations, or perhaps confirm the allegations that have been, I think, something that Canadians have felt quite disturbing.
But Katie Telford is going to have the same limitations about what she can share and can't share as past witnesses at all of these committees, like Jody Thomas and David Morrison and Mr. Vigneault and all of these people. So, I mean, what's the value of her testifying with those same restrictions that everyone else had?
I think it's fair to say there will be answers she will be able to provide. That's why we've been pushing for a number of weeks to have her appear before the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and these other witnesses as well. I mean, these are all pieces of information that are important to get answers to Canadians. Canadians are concerned about the potential for foreign interference. I don't think there are any Canadians, or very few Canadians actually believe that's had an influence in past elections, but there are concerns. When we look at the United States, when we look at United Kingdom, where very clearly foreign interference, in this case Russian, played a role in changing the election results. We want to make sure that doesn't happen in Canada, and that we preserve those free and fair elections. So
given that, the mandate, the first little bit there in what David Johnston was told to do today, or asked to do today, is that he can look at the entire electoral process. You're satisfied that there's no leashes on the former Governor General in terms of where he can go with this?
We wanted to keep it as wide as possible. So we're satisfied that he should be able to go where the information takes him. The time frame in terms of recommending a public inquiry is relatively short, a couple of months.
2 months.
And I think the time frame for producing the final report is important as well. I think it is a time frame that suits the importance of the issue, but also the urgency of the issue. And as I mentioned, I think for us the most important aspect is getting to a public inquiry. We believe that's needed and warranted, and we want to see that as a recommendation.
Is October 31st enough time for him to do a full examination of this issue if there isn't a public inquiry? It seems like it's a pretty broad and exhaustive area based on everything we've heard, and Halloween's not that far away.
Well, let's see how quickly he jumps into the role, and the work that he does, and the information that he gets. That's the most important thing. But today, I think we moved the government from denying that this was an important issue and not taking action on it to starting to take important action, and the NDP is not going to give up. Jagmeet Singh's been very clear about that.
Okay, Peter, Julian, thanks for your time.
Thank you.